You are both actors. You do know how to project.
Speaking of which, I'm not sure what worked this year. But it occurred to me to take Martin Luther King Day.
That would be fun. Do you mind if, since I'm all the way over here, do you mind if I take my mask off?
No, no.
All right.
We do the same thing.
Excellent.
Just yelling at each other.
For those of you tuning in at home, I promise you, we are being safe.
So distant.
Very distant. Physically, not emotionally. Hello, welcome back to our Christian Ed series, Glorious Companions. Tonight's class is someone that I'm very fond of. I learned about her when I was in seminary and just thought she was very, very interesting and had a lot of good things to say. And so it's nice to revisit her with all of you. Her name is Vida Dutton Scudder. And as usual, I do not have my Book of Common Prayer right in front of me. So I'm going to grab one so that we can say a prayer before or as we begin our class. Oh, let's see. Where's one that she would like? Let's find one that Vida would like. And we'll see who's paying attention if you think I picked a good one. The good thing is there's a prayer for everything. The bad thing is it's hard to narrow it down. Oh, let's do this one. Hi, Donna, come on in. Yeah. So let us pray as we begin our class. Grant, O God, that your holy and life-giving Spirit may so move every human heart, and especially the hearts of the people of this land, that barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, and hatreds cease, that our divisions being healed, we may live in justice and peace through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, so Vida, I love Vida. I hope that you all enjoyed learning about her as much as I have enjoyed learning about her in the past few years. Here, I thought this was a particularly good quote for us to use here in the Episcopal Church, and you can tell that she was an Episcopalian by what she has to say, yea, even at the turn of the 20th century. What accredited type of piety did the United States inherit from the last century? Suave-mannered, pleasant-voiced, endangering nothing in particular, an ornament to the Sunday pews, devoted to good causes in proportion to their remoteness, intent on promoting safe philanthropies and foreign missions, but so far as home affairs are concerned, ignorant alike of the ardors of the mystic and the heroisms of the reformer. What she is saying is living into the Episcopalian marred vision of being the frozen chosen. Is it something I actually have to do? Do I have to get my hands dirty? Can I show up on Sunday morning as an ornament in the pews and feel good about myself as a Christian without stirring very far from my seat in church or from my seat at home? Keep in mind, this is not necessarily a bad thing. I think that Vida would say it's a great first step. You have to start somewhere, and church is a wonderful place to start. And it's not the fault of the congregation, but the fault of the church at large and of her clergy that we still are not actively promoting. Yes, of course, we want you to support foreign missions. Of course, there are people all over the world who need help. Of course, there are things that we can do that require funds rather than service, but what are you doing right where you are? And as luck would have it, the very head of our outreach committee, David Kelly, is here tonight. And he has been instrumental in helping all saints get their hands dirty, so to speak, with more and more activities around here. But that's really what she's trying to say. Yes, please do go to church. Yes, please do promote these safe philanthropies and foreign missions. But also, where is your ardor? Where is this love-struck mysticism that calls you to serve people because you love God and want to love God's people? Where are the heroisms? Where are you a hero in reforming social conditions and social justice? Certainly, that's where she would have wanted us to head towards. So let's see more about her. Well-born, very well educated, well situated as a professor at an upscale college, Wellesley in Massachusetts, college for women, and yet she was disturbed by that very good situation in which she found herself. Why? The writer of our book says that, as she wrote, her privilege was unshared. And that unshared privilege that she had was, as she says, a fret that would not heal. So this little ache in her, this little spiritual abrasion that just kept irritating her, because here she was as a well-born, well-educated, well-situated woman, which first of all was not the norm at the time for women to be in positions where they could have that kind of status. But she looked all around her and saw that it was not the norm and wondered why she could not figure out ways to make that better. And she wanted to figure out ways to make that better. And by golly, she did. So as I say here, she didn't just sit there and contemplate it and then say, oh, well, that's just the way of the world. I'm going to go teach my class now. With a group of like-minded and other very strong-minded women, they began establishing settlement houses. So what that meant is they were providing food and housing, room and board for disadvantaged people, usually families, usually women and children, where they were widows or where the husband had left, caring for them. And during the periods of time where class was out of session, these college women, the students, would go and live there and spend all their time working with, educating, helping, living cheek by jowl with all of these underprivileged families so that they could really get a chance to know them. It wasn't something, again, Vita was very big on not separating, no separation in between, oh, they're there, I want to help you, and no, I want to be with you. It wasn't doing something for someone, it was doing something with someone. And I think that's something we should all be looking to emulate. So they lived among the poor that they wanted to serve and they wanted to bring up with them. And this desire to serve in Vita Dutton Scudder became this desire to look beyond that, not just, okay, these are people that are in a disadvantaged situation, how can we work with them? It was, there are lots and lots of people in disadvantaged situations. Why? What's the underlying cause of so much of a separation in between the rich and the poor? I'm not a pessimist, but I would like to point out that this is something that we see in scripture in the Old Testament, so thousands of years ago, in the New Testament, just a couple thousand years ago, when Vita Dutton Scudder is writing about it about 100 years ago, and certainly now. This is an ongoing issue. And as far as long-term solutions, hard to imagine that there is one. We've gone for thousands of years without really finding anything that worked on any kind of broad scale. But as I said in the beginning, you have to start somewhere. And rather than looking at something that is working or failing many, many miles away from you, what can you do where you are? And she would have emphasized that. So her questions would have been something like this. Is voluntary charity, which is to say, I am giving up my time or my money or both of those things to work with people who are in need, is voluntary charity to relieve the consequences of social inequality? So am I giving up my time, money, other resources to relieve somebody's social inequity? Is that a sufficient expression of Christian social conscience? Is that enough for us? It's a good place to start. Is it enough? And her other question would have been, could the way that money is made and distributed and spent be as much a matter of Christian concern as what the possessor does with it? So if I have lots and lots and lots and lots of money, and I have made it in ways that are above board, and everything is clean and my employees are well taken care of, but I spend not 1 cent of my own money to relieve the plight of others, is that still a concern? These are not simple questions. These are multi-layered questions. And before we move on, I'm gonna take a look and see who is joining us tonight. I've got Brenda up here. I've got Beth joining us and Carol Butke. So Brenda, Beth, and Carol, I know the folks that are sitting here in person can't see you, but I can, and we can certainly hear you if you want to unmute yourselves. What do we think so far? And this applies if someone in person would like to speak. What do we think of Vita's questions so far? Any thoughts on where we've come in just this little beginning of our introduction to Vita and what she has going on? Any thoughts on that? David?
Well, okay.
Speak loud so we can hear you.
I know. Well, I don't know the first one, involuntary charity. Yes, the answer is we certainly help people by giving them food and clothes and stuff like that. But the question that she mentioned, the transition she made, is the answer is the social inequality. It's not a question that they're bad people. I have been reading Dickens wrote a novel, actually it's a New Year's novel, along with 3 other Christmas novels, or novelettes, called The Chimes. And one of the things that comes out of it is the rich people, or these substantial people, have gotten the poor people in the play to think of themselves as bad. Mm. And one of the things
that's a very Victorian thing, by the way.
Absolutely. But my sense is that the fact that they're not bad, they didn't make themselves, they didn't do evil. Some of them, maybe some of them did, but for the most part, they didn't do evil. They just happened to be born in the wrong place to the wrong people. And they got jobs that don't pay them enough money. And my sense is it's not a question. It's great. It's a good thing. It goes a good ways towards helping them to provide them with food and donations. But the fact is that the best thing that she moved into that was to say we need to change the system.
Right. So David was telling us about a story by Charles Dickens, which is very Victorian in tone, kind of implying, not Dickens was implying this, but the wealthy people in this story try and make the poor people believe that it's their fault. There's something wrong with them, that they're poor. You didn't work hard enough, you didn't do something. I'm not sure the details of the story, but where Vita would have gone with a story like this is, okay, the poor people aren't broken, the system is broken. And I think that's probably true. Donna, what did you want to say?
Just in like a similar mindset of just like, I feel like this is questions that I've been asking myself for years, and I feel like I've been lost in the realm of like, am I the only, and this does not sound humble at all, but I feel like I've been going crazy. Like, am I the only person in the room that really sees that it's the systems that are the problem? And yes, like the amount of charity that we do is amazing. Like every Christian does some to an extent, I believe. And also non-Christians, but the fact of the matter is, like, those charities still perpetuate the system. And so reading Vita's work and it being like such a long time ago is so validating to know that. And I've studied other people who have said these things, but again, it was just like, oh Jesus, thank you. Like, yeah. Thank you for Vita's work and affirmation of just like, yeah, this obviously there is no perfect system, but in order to, I think share that vision and I don't know, bring some like unity between every sect of religion to know that like there can be still better ways and better systems. Yeah, so sure, it relieves some consequences, but I don't think it's sufficient enough. Yeah.
And relieving the consequences doesn't actually fix the problem. It's like if you have a terrible headache because you are very sick, you can take a Tylenol and your headache will be gone. However, you're still sick and you actually have to fix the illness instead of just the symptoms. And I feel like some charity is more symptom related than actual cause related. Mary?
You all may have seen this. There's a wonderful quote by Desmond Tutu. He says, we can only fish people out of the river for so long before we move upstream to find out why they're falling in the water. Yeah. And it's a great metaphor for this.
It is, yes. Mary referenced a quote by Desmond Tutu, blessed be his name, that he rest in peace and rise in glory, that you can only rescue people, fish people out of the river for so long before you go upstream to find out why they're falling in. I think that's a great, great parallel. Anybody at home want to say anything about this? Quiet bunch. Okay, we'll move on. We will keep moving on. So one of the things that she says that's quoted in our chapter is, I would rather never again wear a thread of woolen than know my garments had been woven at the cost of such misery. Okay, again, this is more than 100 years ago. And she is kind of bewailing the plight of garment workers, mill workers in the United States. Who makes the clothes that we're wearing right now? And how are those people treated? This study from 2019 says the latest data collected from industry sources show that the monthly minimum wages for garment workers vary significantly in the world, ranging from as low as the equivalent of $26 US dollars a month in Ethiopia to a US dollar amount of almost $1,800 in Belgium. That's from 2-3 years ago. The world average stood at $470 a month that year. Most garment workers are not working in the United States and in westernized countries. Most of them are working in developing nations. And so they're making and this is, who knows what inflation has done, 3 years since then. So the question is, if you are working for a company, a garment company, let's say it's one owned by one of our big chain stores, let's say it's Walmart brand, for example, and all of those clothing manufacturers are outsourced to countries that are paying, let's be generous. Let's say it's the world average of $470 a month, but it's probably less than that if you are working somewhere in Vietnam or Singapore or one of the other particularly Asian developing nations. You're probably not making that much. Where's the rest of the money going? This goes back to the question that she would have posed, that second question that she would have posed. Could the way that money is made be as much a matter of Christian concern as what the possessor does with it? So her follow-up question to something, a statistic like that, which even 100 years later would not have surprised her. Just what I said, if the workers aren't being compensated fairly, but the company is experiencing high profits, where is the money going? I used Walmart as an example, but quite frankly, that's kind of an outdated one, because now we have companies much larger than Walmart ever was, and CEOs and business owners of these companies, single people, one person that is receiving the bulk of the largesse from their own company. And I'm not going to mention any names, but I'm sure that there are a few floating around in your heads right now who continue to treat their workers unfairly, who continue to deny health insurance, other benefits, fair working conditions, unions, all of these other things. This is upstream. This is going from the part where people are falling into the river and starting to explore upstream and saying, oh, if all of these people are doing the work, but not receiving any of the fair pay or benefits, here's where they're not falling into the river. Here's where they're getting pushed in to the river. This is Vida Dutton Scudder's crusade brought into the 21st century for sure. We talked about this during our last class. Our last class, we talked about F.D. Morris, who is the Christian theologian that we studied a couple of weeks ago before Christmas. And so I wanted to refresh your memory on the definition of Christian socialism. This is from their website. And if you want to know more, if you have questions, if you're concerned about this term, their website is the place to go. It's much more than I want to get into or can get into right now. But by their definition, we seek God's new creation of a society marked by the interdependent health of our common earthly home, the shared enjoyment of our commonwealth, and the just participation of all in our common social and political life together. Vida Dutton Scudder would not only have agreed with that, she probably helped at some point way back in the early days of American Christian socialism to draft something very much like this. At the time where she was beginning to discuss socialism, it was still a fairly new concept. Communist Russia did not yet exist. It was basically pure Marxist and Engels, but pure Marxist ideology that was being visited on a world that didn't know anything about it yet. And in its purest form, she would have espoused that. But we'll talk about what happens when the communist takeover of Russia happened. She was not happy about that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But what she did endorse was more power and more resources being given over to the workers rather than the people who felt as though they owned the workers but received all of the profits without doing as much of the work. That would have been one of the ways in which she would have said, okay, this is the way that things should start moving in that direction. One of the things that comes up in the reading is economic determinism. The author of our book talks about how she was working with all of these women who were underprivileged and working very, very hard, but still having a very difficult time making ends meet, providing for their families. Economic determinism says that economic relationships are the foundation upon which all other societal and political arrangements in society are based. The author says her efforts had less impact on poor women than their low wages, long hours, and demeaning working conditions, which made impossible their full spiritual and intellectual development. Basically put, what that means is if you're freezing cold, you don't have enough food to eat, and your children are suffering, living into your fullest spiritual and intellectual stature is going to be very hard. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If your basic needs aren't getting met, there's no way you're going to be able to reach towards any kind of higher need. Never mind education, never mind going to church and having the inner resources to be able to dwell upon who God has called you to be, who God is encouraging you to raise your children to be. None of these things are going to matter if your basic needs aren't getting taken care of. So economic determinism is just a way of saying your economic status is going to very heavily shape what you are able to do with the rest of your life. You will have more leisure if you have more money. You will have more educational resources. You'll have more entertainment and enrichment and cultural resources at your disposal. You will have time to go to church on a Sunday morning or a Saturday evening or whenever it is, rather than trying to get some sleep or having to be at work, okay? So this is all part of what discouraged her so, was that as hard as she worked trying to build these women up, there's only so much you can do when their basic needs aren't getting met. The other thing that she would have concentrated on is the concept of class consciousness. So class consciousness is when people are very aware. There are clear layers, stratifications of social status, not only because of money, but across all categories encompassing what we would call a quality of life. Just as I said, your leisure, your education, the way you raise your family, and us versus them mentality, which soured, as they say, human relationships. A nasty thing that people can say is, well, you know, money can't buy class. Ever heard that being said about somebody? Nouveau riche. Well, you know, they may have money, but they don't know the good operas, or, you know, he may have a good job, but do you know where he went to school? Unthinkable. So class consciousness, and then again, economic determinism. Those were two things that she would have concentrated on as being part of that root problem. I'm going to pause here and see if anyone has anything they'd like to say. So I see Art and Bobby have joined us. That's good. So Brenda, Beth, Carol, Art and Bobby at home, David, Mary, and Donna here. Anything we'd like to say about any feelings that we have about what we're talking about so far with this next section of Vita Dutton Scudder, and how we address some of these problems of economy and social status and helping people without, you know, being able to really help them the way in which we'd like, because so many of their basic needs are going unmet. Brenda, I see you're off mute.
Yeah, well, I think that people have a feeling that if you're a certain race and if you make a certain amount of money, that you're better off than a person who might live in the ghetto and maybe smarter than that person who makes $1 million, but doesn't have the opportunity. And because of the prejudice, won't ever be able to do that. And it's happened so many times. And just because you have money doesn't mean that you're smarter than me or you or you know, but their mentality, I guess, being raised with the privilege, they think they're better than us. And, you know, they're in charge of the company or whatever. So, you know, it's hard. It's very hard to prove that you are above what they think you are.
Right. And not only does that make the world really miss out on some really great resources, some people who have a lot to offer, it paves the way for a lot of corruption. Anybody remember a few years ago, it was Lori Loughlin and what was the other actress's name, where they were buying their kids' way? They were, yeah, Felicity Huffman.
Right.
I was so disappointed about that. Where they were hiring people to write their daughter's college essays for them and you know, turning in fake SAT results and things like that so that they could get into these really good schools. And the whole thing just blew apart. But now, what, 2 or 3 years later, do we think that just knowing that that did happen at least twice, haha, do we think that that stopped the practice? No, people just got better at hiding it. And that's been going on for a long time. David?
Right.
I think it's interesting to me that classism is eventually evolves into racism, or at least is wrapped up in racism. But I had a fascinating experience. I substitute taught in a school in Vineyard, Connecticut, which is a pirate town. And I have to saw this very pretty young blonde woman say to her friend, "Oh, my mother would never let me, or my parents would never let me go out with him. He's Irish." And what I find interesting is it's like, it's all of the, everybody is the other. It's, you know, racism is the worst of it, but it's also classism and ethnicness and so on.
Right. And that goes, David was telling a story about how he overheard a student in a wealthy area of Connecticut say to her friend, "Oh, my mother would never let me date that person. He's Irish." So this is like a living, yeah, 1980s, 1990s. This is a key example of class consciousness. Has nothing to do with anybody's worth or value or quality or intelligence or anything. It's just, we have it in our minds that things and people are a certain way. And it's very hard to break out of it. And even the best people, it's impossible not to have prejudices and preformed ideas about people. What you should be able to do, though, is to say, okay, I'm learning that things are not as I've been told they were by my parents or my teachers or my friends or whatever. What is the truth of some kind of situation? If it's hurting people or hurting, for even worse, an entire group of people, how can I be better? How can I make things better for myself, for them, for the world? Mary.
I thought at the very beginning, the mention of privilege was interesting, because we're learning a lot now about white privilege. And, you know, people say then, "Oh, you know, I don't have any advantages because I'm white." Oh, yes, you do. You just don't know about it. And I think the same thing happens in class, particularly when people make judgments. Oh, people are poor because they make bad decisions, or people are poor because they got raised in bad families. So people don't recognize that they themselves experience privilege that makes life easier for them, right? The whole thing of, you know, being born a third just I think it's easy for us to attribute our successes to our own worth and not admit what went into the advantages that we have.
Because to us, they're invisible. And I don't know how many of you remember, it was almost 2 years ago now, Brenda and Janine and Arlene Preston and Colleen Channer all talked to us. We had those caring conversations when things were really at their worst, I feel like, in the summer of 2020. And I wanted us to be able to hear from some of our parishioners of color about invisible privilege. And Brenda, you in particular had a really, would you mind sharing with us the story that you told then about stopping at the ice cream place with your parents when you were a kid?
Oh, well, we were going to West Virginia to visit my grandparents, and my father was driving the car, and my mother, who was very fair and could have passed for white, she decided to go into the store. And when she went into the store, we were in the car, and the person looked out and saw my father, who is brown skinned, and said, well, you have to go to the back. You're not allowed to go in the front. And she decided, well, forget it. I'll just go. And so we drove off. But it was because my father was, well, they said he's black, you know, and they wouldn't serve her. So we didn't get ice cream.
I'll buy you all the ice cream you want, Brenda. But that, most of us have never had to think twice about, those of us who are white have probably never really had to think twice about, is it safe for me to go in here? Am I going to be waited on politely? Am I going to get, so all of these things that we're talking about, economics, social classes, racism, all of these things, Vida Dutton Scudder was heavily invested in finding out the roots of where these prejudices come from and how we can kind of untangle them and work them out into a society that is more equitable and more fair. But she would have said, I'll get to you, David, she would have said politics are not enough. Right now, you know, for most of this class, we've been talking straight politics. But remember, she was a church woman. She was an Episcopalian. She was a faithful Episcopalian. And she actually joined sort of an out in the world monastic order that didn't require any cloistering or any vows like that, but that dedicated themselves to being the church in the world. So politics would not have been enough for her. The book says, of all the world's religions, Scudder felt Christianity was best positioned to help bring about the new social order because of its two key teachings: the incarnation. God has in Jesus Christ personally entered human life and institutions and works within them. And the atonement. God demonstrated on the cross that selflessness, not self-gratification, defines the good life. So what she would have translated that to say is the incarnation. God did, you know, what is the word I'm going to, divests himself of godly power in many ways, almost all of them, in order to enter into our human lives, personally entered the human life, the institutions in it, which is to say the politics and the church and the family and everything, and worked within them so that we may do the same. And also through the atonement, which is to say giving up enough of his powers so that he allowed his own death to occur on the cross, so that we might see that giving up yourself and what you think is valuable in a worldly sense is the way to go, not your own interests coming first. David, what was it that you wanted to say? Okay. So for her, there was a deep spiritual, religious, institutional church component for that. She was never at any point one to say, well, I think we should just do away with the institutional church altogether. In fact, the preface to one of her works says, if you're not interested in being part of an institutional church, this book is not for you. Because she strongly believed that this is where the work has to begin. That it's actually where the work had its genesis, no pun intended, in the life of God and God's people. So she was deeply committed to the church. She wasn't saying, let's all be Christian anarchists. No, no. She wanted us to remain a church, but she wanted the work to happen. Here's what she has to say about socialism. And I know that this can be a tricky subject. The notions of socialism, communism, capitalism have all strayed very far from where they were originally intended to be. Maybe not communism so much. That was never intended to be so great as they trumpeted it to be. But here's what she says. And this is a strong statement, and I acknowledge that, and can be a little shocking for people that are not really on board with it just yet. The ultimate source of my socialist convictions was and is Christianity. Unless I were a socialist, I could not honestly be a Christian. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about F.D. Morris in our last class, because he had a lot of the same leanings, and where I pointed you to take just a kind of the biggest example that I can think of off the top of my head, although there are many more, is where we see the early church, before it was even called the church, in the book of Acts. In the book of Acts, they're talking about this community where they have very rich and very poor and everybody in between. Some people have a whole lot, some people have nothing. And in the book of Acts, what they describe is everybody chucked their stuff into the common pool. And if you needed something, you got something. And if you had something to give, you gave it. And in that way, working together and contributing together, everybody got what they needed, plus a little extra left over that they could give to other people. So to sustain them for the work that God was calling them to do. So when Vida Dutton Scudder talks about Christian socialism, this is one of the ideals that she has in mind. Where we come up with a rub, a lot of us, when we hear about Marxism, socialism, communism, and I've gotten into this discussion with a lot of people, is, but they don't want religion. In fact, it was Marx that said religion is the opiate of the masses. Right, that's true, he did say that. How did she reconcile that? Because he was very anti-church and anti-Christian. So how does Vida Dutton Scudder reconcile that? She asked herself and asks us to ask ourselves, how has the church universal, not just the Episcopal Church, but Christian institutions worldwide, how has the church universal served the rich in favor of the poor? How have people with a lot of money to give been favored historically in the workings of the church? If that has happened, then we can't really blame some people for taking a dim view of the institution in general. Has the church been unfaithful to Christ's mission of proclaiming good news to the least of these? And in that proclaiming, not just saying, they're there, Jesus loves you, and moving away. When we say proclaim the good news, we mean the way that Jesus did it, which is to teach the rich and the poor, to heal people who are in need of healing, to feed people who need to be fed, and on and so forth. So have we been doing that? Has any church been faithful to that long-term throughout history? Have there been examples where people can rightly look at the institution of the church universal and say, you're doing it wrong, okay? And you're actually hurting people rather than helping people. We have to understand why some people take kind of a jaundiced view of institutional religion, Christianity included. Certainly, Marx was one of those people. Is it possible that political ideology of all kinds would be different if the church had been more faithful to its mission? I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to ask for any feedback about those questions that we're talking about. I don't know if I can answer all of your questions about socialism and communism and capitalism, but I want to stop. I'm not a political, just so you know, I am not a political scientist. I am a common, humble country priest, but I know a little enough to be dangerous, so I'll try to keep the danger out of it. But I would like to hear some of your thoughts on this, about pure Marxism as Vida Dutton Scudder, and how that might or might not align with our vision of who Jesus is. Not necessarily what the institutional church is, but who Jesus is in the realm of that particular socialist sphere. Any thoughts on that? Donna?
Yeah, I feel like, for me personally, since like the first lockdown during COVID, it was like the moment that I really started to reflect my own privilege, as well as George Floyd's murder. And I bring that up because it wasn't until then that I realized, I think, how much capitalism plays into how religion was taught to me.
What tradition did you grow up in, just to clarify?
Sure. Yeah, so I grew up evangelical Protestant, and so I just feel like I am so like ashamed of what was taught to me, of like, well, even though it was taught to me, like, you know, let go of all your things and like let your life begin again with Christ. It was not actually happening in action from those who were teaching that. And so, you know, I get I get that America, United States in a lot of ways, like, it's a build your own capitalistic society, and, you know, we say that anyone can make it here, but that's not true at all. And so, you know, again, just hearing like the socialist perspectives in Scudder's reading was just fascinating, and then her bringing up Marx was just like really crazy, because I just feel like there were so many times, even in like, I studied history, and so even in history classes, like Marx is taught from the perspective of like, just not something you would ever want in America. And it's just fascinating how much I've been drawn to this discussion over the past few years, and yeah, I'm just kind of blown away by it. I also feel like within my own reflection, like I've really been pondering the idea of like, there are people that I was taught and that people around me still treat like as if they're less than, and like, how am I personally reflecting and how am I personally responding to those around me? Even in just like the way I walk and the way I talk, like, am I greeting people differently? Am I spending time with people differently because I know their status? So it's just been like so many fascinating questions reflecting on my privilege as a white woman and as someone who's been financially fine the majority of my life. But it is really interesting. I'm just like absolutely floored at the whole discussion, really.
Right.
Yeah.
It should for us. It should make us think. I don't want us to be in total distress about this, but I do want us to think about it. Mary?
I had an experience in college that shook me and still does. I was at the Interfaith House on campus, and I ran into I was friends with the Episcopal priest there, and I think we just finished a communion service or something, and I met a man outside of the office who he looked as if,
You can step up to that microphone if you want.
that's okay, I'll just be really loud. He reminded me of like a modern day John the Baptist. And he said, you know, if you have two coats, you're supposed to give away one. If you have, and I'm like,
Just standing out there saying these things?
he was addressing it to me. I guess I looked like I had two coats or something. And at the time I went, yeah, I know, but does anybody really do that? Do you give up everything? And do I sell all that I have and give it to the poor like the rich young man? And I felt bad that I didn't want to do that, and I knew I wasn't going to go home and get my coat. But it just made me think about, you know, was Jesus for real when he was asking us to do this stuff? As I said, I haven't resolved this question at all.
If it makes you feel any better, theologians argue about this question still. Did Jesus really mean it? Did he really mean it? Remember this though. In one of the tellings of that story, because it shows up in, I think, 2 Gospels. In one of the tellings of the story, the writer phrases it like this. The rich man has just said, "What must I do to enter the kingdom of heaven?" And the phrasing says, Jesus looked at him and loved him and said, "Sell all you have and give it to the poor." So the love comes first. The admonition comes afterward. Do I think he meant it? I absolutely think he meant it. Can we live into that? Most people can't, but you know, I was talking about this with somebody earlier today. That's why we have saints. That's why saints are saints, because they're people who say, okay, I'm all in, and they do it. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute when we talk about Saints Francis and Catherine, who were kind of the saintly touchstones for Vida in her life. But yeah, I think that Jesus meant those things, but we are conditioned from the beginning, you know, from the beginning of Scripture. You can see how we are conditioned to be exclusive and tribal and hold on to what we have and fight tooth and nail to keep the material possessions that we have. From the beginning of human society, Jesus is countercultural in every way, all the time, even now. And it's really hard to live into that, but that's why we have those examples that are like, wow, they were awesome. Not me though. They're great. I'm awesome. I'm glad they're here, but I can't do that. David,
Go ahead and say what you want to say.
One of the problems, I mostly agree with everything she did and said, but a problem I've always found to some degree with socialism, she brings it up. If you're going to pay a bunch of workers to do something for you, that they should be paid, everybody should get something, or, but the person that needs it more should get more. My sense is then you run into the whole concept of meritocracy, and my sense is, okay, if the person is if it's a seamstress, if they're seamstresses, it's the best seamstress in the place who puts out a tremendous amount of work and all that, she gets paid less than the seamstress who has multiple kids and no husband. And my sense is that there's a part of people that resist that idea.
so David is talking about the dangers of, one of the dangers of a socialist society is the risk of running it into a meritocracy, or actually moving against being a meritocracy, where if people are getting paid according to what they need rather than what they do, then the very talented person will not be getting paid as much as the person who's supporting her family. Right, and I don't have an answer for you, but what I do have is a scriptural example. Do you know what it is? Mary?
It's the workers who arrive late in the day.
Yes, it's the workers in the vineyard. You know that story where they go out really early in the morning and they say, well, I need workers for my field, come work for me. And they go out there at the crack of dawn. They come back out at noon and they get some more. They come back out in the afternoon, they get some more. They come back out in the evening. And at the end of the workday, they're all standing waiting for their pay. And the people there were there early in the morning like, yes, I'm gonna be making bank. I'm gonna be getting so much money because I was here all day. And as they go down the line getting paid, everybody gets the same amount. That story makes people so mad. It made them mad then, it makes people mad now. But process that story as you're thinking about what we've talked about tonight. I think it's worth thinking about. Any other comments from the folks at home before we move on? Okay, let's keep going because we're running short on time. So again, when the Soviet regime embraced the brutality and violence of full-scale communism, she again said, this has nothing to do with the theology, with Christianity tied up with the meaning of socialism. This is something that needs to come from within, an inward spiritual transformation that then changes the entire social system. The Christian transformation is not going to work with what they're doing over there with communism, with communist socialism. And I think I said this when we were studying F.D. Morris, but for reasons too detailed, there would be a whole nother weeks or 2 weeks worth of classes. Just so you know, and please look this up because I'm not going to spend the time telling you what the differences are. Socialism and communism are not the same thing. I have this argument with people often, and it's a long-winded argument, and I don't feel like getting into it, but just so you know, and do look it up, socialism and communism, and quite frankly, pure Marxism, are not equal, not the same things. So here we talk about Saints Catherine and Saint Francis. Catherine of Siena and Saint Francis of Assisi, both people who willingly, cheerfully gave up all that they had to serve God. Saint Francis in particular was key for her because he was born into a wealthy family, a privileged family. And when he heard God's call to him, he left all of that and became as poor as he could possibly be, started the Franciscan tradition and accumulated no goods. All of the goods of the monastery were shared and shared alike. Catherine of Siena, in a similar way, began her own order. She looked to them as her inspiration for a saintly life. And so these are two of the key saints that she would have looked at for that. So as we come to the end of this class, here are some questions that I'd like for us to think about And if you're at home, just go ahead and unmute yourselves and address these if you want. A fret that will not heal. That's what she wrote about the stirrings of this uncomfortableness with her own privilege. And I think we've actually addressed this a little bit in our class tonight. Some of us have talked about how sometimes our own privilege starts to make us feel a little bit uncomfortable when we think, gosh, I didn't realize it and I didn't intend for this to be the case, but sometimes I have just had things given to me, or I have expected things to happen for me simply because I am something that I have no control over. A white person, a man, a woman, someone with a certain level of education. I've expected things to happen for me, and I didn't know perhaps that it was coming from a privileged point of view, but now that I do, what do I do with that? Anyone want to talk about that? Okay, the next question that I would like for us to think about is, what do the teachings of Jesus have in common with socialist principles? Which is to say, from what we know of Jesus through the writings in the Gospels and what we know of socialism, which I know is not, for most of us, not a huge amount. But when we think about the means of production being more in the hands of the workers, and for the profit from the means of production to be distributed equitably and not all going to one person or one small group of people. When we think about those socialist principles, what do the teachings of Jesus have in common with those? And we've talked about a few of those examples, but I want to hear if there's anything more that you think is relevant there. And on the same token, what about capitalist principles? What in the teachings of Jesus or in the Gospels have to tell us, or how are they in line, if they are, with the capitalist principles that we have? Are we stumped? It's a tough question, and this may not be something that we answer among ourselves or tonight, but they're things that we should be thinking about. Okay.
I think for the second question, the answer, one of the teachings of Jesus have to become is a lot, and what with capitalism, not much.
Okay, David has summed it up. He says, what do the teachings of Jesus have to do in common with socialist principles? David says a lot. What about with capitalist principles? He says, not much. Okay, pretty cut and dried on that one. Anyone agree with that? Donna agrees with that. Mary, what about you?
I'm trying to think of what capitalist principles are. I don't think I understand capitalism terribly well.
Keeping in mind that what we have in the United States is not as communism is to the Soviet Union or the former Soviet Union, United States capitalism is to the United States. And so many economic principles and policies have been, for lack of a better word, sort of bastardized as they've come through different iterations in different places in the world, and the United States being one of them. It went from, I have a skill that you don't have. I can produce things that you don't produce. And I'm now selling enough of them that I can hire people to make these with me or, eventually for me. And as I sell them, I find that I can sell them above the cost that I pay for the materials because I need to make a living wage. That's fair. I'm paying my employees well. I'm getting my cut so that I can provide for myself and for my family. And I'm providing a service that other people aren't providing, or if they are, it's inferior, or if it's a higher cost or something. That's not a bad thing.
And there's the concept of people investing in me.
And there is a concept of people investing in what I do.
Who are going to take a flyer and say, yes, I'll support you. And
right.
If they, if I succeed.
Right.
That's not a bad thing either.
No, those
like it's unfettered capitalism or unfair practices or
Right. And then when you start talking about, oh, well, you know what? I own a prison because I own a privately owned United States prison. And in essence, I can use slave labor and pay them pennies on the dollar to make goods and provide services. A lot of call centers are run by federal prisons. Did you know that? So I can then use basically indentured slavery with people that are in prison who are not getting paid anywhere near what other people would be getting paid for this work, and still reap the profits in ways that benefit me and mostly only me, and the people who are paying much, much less to get these goods and services on behalf of their companies. That's not quite on, as they say. That's evil, yeah. So you can see just in the span of socialism, socialism, capitalism, capitalism. There are ways to make anything better. There are ways to make things worse. And when you get to the extremes of anything, chances are you're veering it in a direction that it should not go. Factory farming is a direct result of rampant capitalism.
Can I add, like, right now, I think we're in a phase, in my personal opinion, that like capitalism in America right now, especially with some of the people you were referring to, who will remain aimless, like it is going to the other extreme. And it's, I mean, I think it's my faith in Jesus that has convicted me of it, of like, what is going on? Like, this is not.
It's wacky. People are using their privilege in wacky ways.
I'm a member of my family who professes themselves to be a libertarian.
Speak loud. Speak loud.
I have a member of my family who professes themselves to be a libertarian.
Okay.
And I said, what does that mean to you? He said, well, I ought to be able to purchase anything I want. And I thought that was strange, and I thought that not while I was too slow on the uptake. But I wanted to say, if I had to say that late time back in the, does that mean you can purchase drugs? Does that mean you can buy a child to have sex with? I mean, this unfettered sense of my personal freedom.
Yes, and see, yeah. Yeah,
David has a relative who is a self-proclaimed libertarian who doesn't really seem to know what that means, because what that means is he wants just unfettered purchasing power and personal freedom, and that's not quite. Tell him to go read Ayn Rand and get back to you. So the last question is one that I really want us to focus on for now, and that is, how does a life of prayer relate to a life of action? One of the things that Vida Dutton Scudder has said, and I was looking for the book that I have by her and I could not find it anywhere, the book that I have from seminary, and I couldn't find the quote anywhere, but it stuck with me since I read it these many years ago. She says, what the church prays for, the church works for. And every time I'm putting together the prayers of the people for a Sunday or a Wednesday or any one of our services, I think about how the Book of Common Prayer is laid out. I think about our baptismal vows and how we pray to respect the dignity of people and strive for justice and do all of these things. And by this consistent life and saying the words of prayer and really lifting our prayers up to God, that is going to help us act on what we are praying for. And to go farther back, the Latin phrase that is often brought up in terms of the Book of Common Prayer, but predates it by centuries, if not more, lex orandi, lex credendi. Praying shapes believing. What we pray shapes the way we feel about God and shapes the actions that we take as God's people here on earth. So how might a life of prayer, how might what you pray for inspire you to act on something? If you see in our church announcements or in the weekly email that we are, collecting food and clothing donations, something as small as that, like I said, it's a great starting point. And you might pray, gosh, I'm going to pray for the people in our community that are cold and hungry. And then you think, oh, but you know what? I'm praying for them, but I also have plenty of money to go to the grocery store and get some food for them. I also have this stack of coats that belonged to my children 20 years ago, or I can just go buy some and do that. Or I can bring them there and be with people while I help provide for them, and. So as you see things that come up for you that are worthy of prayer, help to think of how it can be worthy of action after that. I think we've talked about this before. Christians get a bad rap for getting on TV after a major tragedy, and what do they say? Our thoughts and prayers are with you. Great, thanks. Could you do something too? Again, this goes back to what Mary said, the quote from Desmond Tutu, at some point, you've got to stop pulling people out of the river and go upstream to find out why they're falling in or being pushed in, as the case may be. And as you pray for those that are leading disadvantaged or different lives from yours, without the kind of privilege, without the kind of wealth, however small you might think it, that you have, hopefully, and Vita Dutton-Scudder would have said, yes, by all means, it's not just hopefully, it will. As you pray for these things, you will learn how to make them manifest. You will act on these things. So that's our class for tonight. I know that it was heavy duty. I know we got a lot of different concepts that some of us may not have heard before and may not be entirely comfortable with, but I want you to sit with your discomfort. If you are uncomfortable or if you're deeply curious about the things that were brought up tonight, I want you to think about that, and I want you to learn more about why you feel the way you do and what you feel is the better way, if there is one, or what you feel is something different that you could learn about. That's really important for us as Christians to take on new things and new disciplines and new prayers that please God help us to new actions. Thank you, everybody. Next week is a vestry meeting, so we will not have class next week, but we'll pick it back up on the 19th. I'm learning my dates. So yes, we'll pick it back up on January 19th. And hold on, so you can get a head start on who we're going to be studying. For our next class, we are going to go with Evelyn Underhill, because since we're talking about prayer, her subtitle is Guide in the Life of Prayer. I could use a guide in the life of prayer. As somebody who is supposed to be a guide, I need a guide. So let's go with Evelyn Underhill for our next class, and that will be on Wednesday, January the 19th. So hopefully I will see you all then. Have a great night, everybody. Bye-bye.